Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to start my speech with a thank you. I want to thank and acknowledge my granny Minnie, who went to Lejac Residential School for far too many years of her life. She told me growing up, "No complaining, Rachel. We are all still here. Get to work." It took me many years to fully understand that she understood that Canada had tried to kill her community and succeeded in killing too many. And also recognize that although she grew up Indigenous in a country trying to kill Indigenous people, they are still here. She built us strong, carrying a lot of multi-generational trauma that our family continues to work through, and we are strong. And the preciousness of our children is powerful, even for the little 2-year-old white girl they picked up along the way. I want to also thank and acknowledge my husband, who is a survivor of residential school. His love for all of his children and grandchildren is deeply tender and kind. He grapples bravely with the wounds he has and has succeeded in a commitment of making sure that not one of his children or grandchildren will ever see him under the influence of any drug or alcohol. I also want to acknowledge how he has carried the tradition of his people, especially in his spirit baths. He has taken many people to bathe when they come into their maturity as young people and when they are grieving. This includes our 2 sons, Henry and Kai, who completed 1 full year when their voices changed, daily bathing in the river. I want to thank the many elders who have guided me in my life. There are so many who are still with me, and some of those who are on the next step of their journey. I want to thank them for holding me up, setting me straight with a kindness and gentleness that I am still practicing to emulate. I want to thank all the generations of Indigenous children. I want to thank my children and grandchildren who are so generous in their forgiveness for the wounds we are all trying to heal together. I am awed by their love and strength for what they must carry. I also want to send a special moment of love to Rebecca, who lost her mother today several years ago, another victim of a colonial past that damaged so badly and deeply that it was impossible for her to continue. And I want to thank all of the Indigenous parents who have had to tell their young children about residential school sooner than they wanted because of the public discovery of these 215 precious babies. My own sister being one of them. It is hard to know when to tell your children that Canada has and continues to wage a war on you because of who you are, because you are Indigenous. When is the time to tell your child, be prepared for the racism in Canada, because it is coming for you, and it is. At what age is it appropriate to tell your children? One thought every Indigenous parent must think about in this country. I recently heard a non-Indigenous person say, expressing their grief on finding the 215 precious children. They spoke about the loss of innocence they were experiencing in Canada. A much wiser Indigenous woman than I responded with such kindness, acknowledging that for this person, for many Canadians, this revelation has been an awakening. I hope all Canadians are having this awakening and that their perspective of Canada is fundamentally changing. This is what has and is happening in our country. We need to own that as Canadians because this is not a surprise or a shock for Indigenous communities across this country. This is a confirmation. Former Senator and Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner Murray Sinclair said in an interview recently that survivors of residential schools called him and said, "I told you so." I want to say to non-Indigenous Canadians, stop trying to fix this. Help the nations carry it. Carry with you that generations of Indigenous communities have had to carry this knowledge by themselves, that when they told, their voices were ignored and silenced. Understand that this genocide happened and is happening in Canada. Listen and amplify the voices of Indigenous people. And where there is injustice, help the fight. Many Indigenous elders and leaders have said to me, there can be no healing without justice, without truth. It is hard to keep fighting when you are the one that is wounded. What Canada needs now is for all Canadians to stand together and fight the injustice now that are happening today and the ones that have happened in the past. Canadians can help by telling the Government of Canada, both historically and today, to stop putting the responsibility at the nation's doors. Look for the truth. I will give Canadians an example. Yesterday, the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Affairs re-announced $27 million from the 2019 budget to help Indigenous communities find their children who died in residential school, to help bring them home. When the minister was asked, why is the money only coming now? The minister said the communities were not ready before this time. Mr. Speaker, I can promise you, there is not one Indigenous community across this country that was not wanting their children to come home. Today, in the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, the chair of the governing circle from the National Centre of Truth and Reconciliation was very clear in response to the minister that this is simply not the case. She told the committee survivors have been asking for funds for years, especially through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but those requests have been severely underfunded and often not responded to. I believe the chair of the governing circle of National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. I believe the communities and the voices of Indigenous leaders across this country who have told us again and again that there are children buried. I have no doubt that all communities have always been looking for the children to be returned. After hearing this, a chief said to me, "Are First Nations now responsible for investigating their own genocide?" I agree. Whatever action that is taken should be done 100% with the lead of the nations, every single time. However, the reality is Canada is the perpetrator of this genocide. Canada has information that will guide them from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In fact, former Senator Sinclair spoke to the work done to identify potential grave sites. This information, it's there, and I would suggest to this government is a very good place to start. All too often, this government tells Canadians that Indigenous communities have other priorities on one issue or another. I want to be very clear in this House. That is complete gaslighting. What is true is this, that even with the work being done by this government, First Nations children are still in court, and a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order is not being honored. I want to thank Cindy Blackstock for her amazing work on this. And I would say to the Government of Canada, it's time to let her put this burden down. It is time to make sure that no more First Nations children lose their childhood. It's time to step up and do the right thing. It's time to get it done. I also want to say St. Anne Residential School survivors are still being denied access to justice. They're survivors. They have a right to have a voice. And for too long, this government has blindsided them through processes that continue to keep the agony alive. And the implementation of the TRC calls to action are not being honored with the seriousness that they must. We're hearing that from Indigenous communities, and the people who are experiencing it are the experts. That is who we should be listening to. And Mr. Speaker, it is time that there are spaces for trauma healing centers across this country for Indigenous communities. Former Senator Sinclair said it very, very well. It is time for us to have spaces where survivors and their families can come together and share this together. It is time for us to make space for that and honor that. To all of the Indigenous communities across this country, from this deep sadness, what I wish you all is joy. Because for so many generations, with every child that was taken and every child that is continuing to be taken, the joy has been stripped from the communities. It is absolutely time for Canada to step up and recognize the basic human rights of Indigenous communities and finally do the right thing, have justice and have truth so that these communities can finally have joy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.